Unit 2. Tracing the evolution of the concept of culture in connection with social-cultural factors and second language teaching methods from the 80th toward the mid-20th century. In the previous unit, Unit 1, we explored the terminology and typologies used in second language education to describe different facets of culture. Our general distinction was that between object and subject-oriented approaches. Also, we saw hierarchical small c, big C typology, Brötchenkunde und Gretchenkunde model, used to describe different facets of culture and establish an hierarchy within the object-oriented approach. Also, we saw more recent models, such as the 3Ps model: products, practices, and perspectives, and its further modifications. These models demonstrate a trend toward emphasizing the aspects of culture referring to values, perspectives that regulate human cultural practices, and explaining the meaning of cultural products. We have discovered that conceptual frameworks used to categorize different facets of culture in second language classrooms reflect the transition from an object to a subject-oriented or values-oriented or learner-oriented approach. Because when we start presenting the culture of other people as a set of values manifested in practices and products, and we want our learners to understand and even accept these values, to be able to enjoy different cultural practices, we must inherently consider our learners' cultural values and beliefs. That is because the only way the learners can understand and accept the values of others is by integrating them into their own value system. In other words, by transforming their value system. This transformation process is individual and learner or subject-oriented. In the current unit, Unit 2, we will review these typologies by placing them in the historical context. We will take a closer look at the essential stages of the evolution of the concept of culture in connection with social, cultural, and intellectual history factors that influenced this evolution, and second, in connection with second language teaching methods, the most known of them. We will focus on the emergence of the object-oriented approach in the period covering the 18th, 19th, and mid-20th century. And our exploration will be accompanied by examples found in vintage second language textbook. The learning objectives of the unit is tracing the evolution of the concept of culture in connection with social cultural factors and second language teaching methods from the 80th until the mid-20th century. The modern understanding of culture involves some characteristics we believe natural. Important remark, we are limited to the Western European tradition of using the term culture. The first characteristic is that our understanding of culture mandatory has a societal dimension. We refer to cultural products, practices, or perspectives shared by members of a social group. Also, our understanding of culture is universal and inclusive. For us, any social group, any nation has a culture. Our representation of culture is often related to national identity. People are proud to be a part of a nation sharing the same culture and language and always willing to emphasize the differences between their culture and those of people living in neighboring countries. Next, we believe that culture and language help us to understand something essential in other people's character, the spirit of nations. And finally, in our mind, Culture is often represented by literature, history, and geography. But the understanding of culture based on these characteristics is relatively recent. Danish professor Karen Risager, a leading expert in cultural second language pedagogy, draws our attention to the fact that the societal conception of culture is not as old. When exactly did we start to apply the notion of culture to any group of people? In his remarkable essay on the evolution of the notion of culture in Europe, Hungarian-Australian philosopher Georgi Marcus shows that the concept culture, borrowed from Latin, originally denoted a cultivated piece of land. From this arose its metaphorical meaning, emphasizing individual dimension. Culture as an active process of ethical and intellectual cultivation of one individual. This understanding of culture was promoted in the 16th and the 17th century by circles of Renaissance humanists. It has been preserved in several expressions we use today in modern languages such as cultured or cultivated person, personne cultivée, cultivierte personne, that mean well-educated, morally and intellectually developed person, or just a person with manners, like in Russian expression культурный человек. Only by the end of the 17th century did the concept of culture start to be used to characterize an entire social group. This meaning was further developed to become dominating in the 19th century. That is why our first stop on the timeline is the period covering the 18th and 19th century. The most important social and intellectual history-related factors that influenced the transition from the individual to the modern societal understanding of culture were the following. The emergence of historicism and human science as we know them today, the establishment of nations accompanied by the emergence of national consciousness and nationalist movements. Finally, contacts with other cultures due to exploratory journeys across the world, which led to the establishment of colonial empires, and emerging educational and touristic traveling across Europe. That is why we can characterize the societal turn in the understanding of culture also as historicist, national, or traveler's turn. The most influential second language teaching approaches associated to this period are the grammar translation method and the direct method. Historicism. The first intellectual factor that influenced the modern understanding of culture was the emergence of historicism or historical thinking. We know that the notion of culture got a societal dimension by the late 17th century. However, the early understanding of culture as a characterization of an entire social group was firmly rooted in the hierarchical and discriminatory opposition between civilized and savage. By analogy with persons of culture as opposed to vulgar mob, non-cultural individuals, the word culture was applied only to well-ordered civil peoples, the Europeans, with urban mores and rich intellectual achievements. Savage or barbarous non-European people were considered as not having culture at all. For example, we can see how the culture is defined in this hierarchical way by German jurist, political philosopher, economist, and historian Samuel von Pufendorf, who taught at the University of Heidelberg in the 1660s. Pufendorf defines culture as all that which occurs to human life in a civil society, possible only under a lawful order secured by the power of a unified state. This hierarchical understanding of culture was challenged by the emergence of historicism. Historicism is a specific type of thinking. It assumes that natural phenomena and human institutions, such as language, art, law, state, are subject of perpetual change. We must understand them according to the inner logic and contextual conditions proper to the specific historical moment when these phenomena are observed. Historical relativism suggests that every people at every historical stage possesses culture. Suppose we want to understand a society different than ours or at a time remote stage of ours. In this case, we cannot directly apply evaluation criteria based on our contemporary values. First, we must ensure that we understand the system of values proper to the society we study in a specific historical context. This innovative understanding of culture was consistently expressed by German philosophers, above all by Johann Gottfried von Herder. In the 1770s and 80s, Herder historicized the concept of culture, but emphasizing that all the people of the world participate in a gradual historical progress of cultivation. Herder believed that culture is something common to humanity that distinguishes humans from animals, and each people have a particular and unique share of this universal human culture. The emergence of historical thinking or historical relativism made possible comparative and historical studies of sociocultural phenomena such as languages, ethnicities, and folklore. Historical thinking gave birth to many human sciences as we know them today. All these disciplines, which German philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey will call later Geisteswissenschaften, humanities, were born in the 19th century. Their methodology is grounded in historical thinking. The second factor that influenced the emergence of the modern understanding of culture was the establishment of nations, national consciousness, and nationalist movement during the late 18th, 19th, and 20th century. A nation is a complex, elusive, and controversial concept that denotes a community of people formed on the basis of a combination of shared features. Among these features, we can find the following: an association with a specific territory, shared history, real or imaginary, like a myth of their region, common societal institutions and political system, common cultural achievements we also call big C culture, common traditions, habits, and mores we call small c culture, but also a common language. In opposition to a simple ethnic group, nation is a more political community which is conscious of its autonomy and particular political interests supported by a common ideology. Also, the concept of nation imposes a specific understanding of the individual. This understanding is based on the perception of the individual as an integral part of a nation. Persons' interests are related to and depend on the interests of the nation the individual belongs to. Human history is full of examples where individuals enthusiastically supporting current political interest and ideology of their nation were considered as true patriots, while citizens of the world were seen as enemies of the nation. The idea of the nation came to replace the weakened concept of dynastic government, the monarchy, and support the emergence of new economic mechanisms related to the enrichment through colonizing new territories and later through industrialization. The idea of nation, often a great nation, ideologically supporting many colonial wars and the creation of imperial powers. In these powers, multi-ethnic and multilingual communities were unified around one dominating ethnic group, one dominating language, one national idea, and one government with a strong army and navy. Today, we can observe how the Russian Federation employs this imperial nationalist rhetoric in the war against Ukraine. Kremlin's official ideology is grounded in the idea that Ukrainian people have never had their own cultural and language identity, always been a part of one multicultural nation where the Russian ethnicity, language, and geopolitical interest play the dominating role. Therefore, Ukrainian people's claim for political and cultural autonomy is considered by Kremlin as a betrayal and even an existential threat, according to Putin expressions, for Russia. In the eyes of Putin's propaganda, the aggression against Ukraine is justified by the mission of unify brotherly peoples belonging to one nation. Ironically, national consciousness has inspired not only the establishment of colonialism but also numerous anti-imperial and anti-colonial movements over the last 3 centuries. Far from all existing conceptions of nation considered language and culture as bounding factors of nation. Some of them emphasized instead the importance of a common territory, common political system, or strong state. The idea of the close relationship between nation, culture, and language has been developed in German intellectual tradition, precisely in connection with the emergence of German national consciousness in the late 18th century. The specific feature of the German nationalist movement was the idea of unifying German ethnicity populating different European states. That is why the notion of nation in early German intellectual tradition emphasized mainly cultural and language aspects before political one. According to Johann Gottfried von Herder, whom we have quoted above in connection with historical thinking, every nation has a national spirit, Volksgeist, which informs the totality of national life or culture, comprising achievements, habits, mores, and traditions. The Volksgeist cannot be apprehended by purely rational means, but rather by an act of empathy. That is why the disciplines studying the spirit of nations through its different manifestations will be named later Geisteswissenschaften. According to Herder, the most characteristic embodiment of the national spirit is the national language, in which the nation's consciousness becomes articulate. Another famous German politician, diplomat, and linguist of that time, Wilhelm von Humboldt, states in the same way that language is the outer appearance of the spirit of people. According to Humboldt, learning a foreign language is the first way to understand the spirit of another nation. Learning a foreign language entails gaining a new standpoint in the previous world view. From the idea of national consciousness expressed through national language and culture arises the idea of national education. The lycée in France and the Gymnasien in Prussia had been conceived from around the turn of the 19th century. Common and standard education for all members of a nation was seen as contributing to building of national identity. The language subject gradually became nationalized and included in the general educating of population towards a nationally structured view of the world. National education system focused first on national languages. However, learning modern foreign languages has been quickly integrated into national education curricula too. The integration of modern languages in the national educational system happened earlier in German-speaking world than in other European countries. Thanks to the guidelines set out by Wilhelm von Humboldt, modern language learning was embedded in the neo-humanist curriculum of the Gymnasien in Prussia at the dawn of the 19th century. Practical political and economic purpose of understanding the spirit of foreign nations through learning foreign languages in schools has been explained by François Gouin, the famous language educator who taught the French in Germany, Switzerland, and England. In his book, The Art of Teaching and Studying Languages, edited first in French and translated into English 10 years later, Gouin compares foreign language learning to a mental railway between nations. This railway allows assimilating the spirit of foreign nation in order to overcome differences between nations and thus promotes international collaboration, brotherhood of nations, exchanging their ideas and the fruits of their activities, peace and liberty, and finally prevents international aggression and conflict. Because nations would never strive to cut each other's throat if they understood each other thoroughly and if healthy and moral hospitality drew them together. Foreign language learning in schools was supposed to play an important political role in the emerging global world. However, if in some countries like Germany the increasing of national consciousness encouraged teaching and learning foreign languages, in others, like England, the similar national feelings hindered it. From his recent study, Simon Coffrey concludes that in Victorian England, the innovative pedagogical trend of teaching spoken language, so-called the direct method, met a considerable opposition because of the cultural belief that fluently speaking a foreign language was not suitable and even unpatriotic for a true English gentleman. Another critical factor that influenced the development of the modern understanding of culture was the contact with other cultures, which became a regular practice thanks to massive exploratory and commercial traveling across the world. Historians call the age of exploration, or the age of discovery, the period when Europeans began exploring the world by sea in search of new trading routes, wealth, and knowledge. This age of exploration ended in the 18th century with the establishment of multiple European colonies that permanently altered the world and transformed it into the modern one we know today. From a purely cultural perspective, the age of exploration and its results enhanced the contact with different non-European civilizations. Therefore, it provided an opportunity to reflect on the differences between nations and contributed to the emergence of the societal, national, and historicist understanding of the culture we discussed about. The traditional written form for this reflection was travel, right? Under the influence of the massive practice of traveling in the 17th and 18th centuries, travel writing became the dominant genre in Europe. At that time, there were no clear boundaries between purely scientific and literary discourse, so countless journals of voyage, sharing personal observations of travelers, combined features of educational, entertaining, but also scientific writing. For example, travel writing provided information for geographical and ethnographical studies. In the 19th century, the description of mores and habits of other peoples by travelers, Charakterbilder, is still important educational resource, as we can see from Karl Müller's book published in the mid-19th century. Travel writing promoted what we can call a traveler's perspective on cultures. This perspective was expressing scientific curiosity and openness toward other cultures. However, at the same time, it was establishing distance by objectivizing other cultures and presenting them as alien and exotic. This point of view, considered rather normal at that time, would by the end of 20th century become the object of criticism as a part of critical and decolonized second language education. The appropriation of others' culture by dominating culture, by presenting other culture as exotic, became the subject of reflection in the seminal book by Edward Said, Orientalism. Said defines Orientalism as a way of seeing the East from the colonial gaze of the West as mysterious, intriguing, and exotic, while at the same time primitive, despotic, and savage. Orientalism reproduced racist idea about Arabic, Islamic, and Asian cultures and people. At the same time, according to Said, it gives European culture its identity by contrasting itself to the Orient. Aside from commercial and exploratory traveling, in the 70s, 80s, and the 19th century, we can observe the emergence of new trend of educational and touristic traveling abroad across Europe. Young aristocrats, primarily men, less frequently women, left their countries to spend 2 to 4 years touring around Europe in an effort to broaden their horizons and learn about language, architecture, history, geography, and culture. This practice was introduced in England, but grew to be widely popular across Europe and the United States. It became known as the Grand Tour. A typical Grand Tour started in London and ran through France and Italy, less often through Germany. The pedagogical purpose of traveling became a common idea in Europe at that time, as expressed by the famous saying, travel broadens the mind, les voyages forment la jeunesse, Reisen bildet. In the entry voyage of the French Encyclopedia, we can read the following. Today, traveling in the civilized states of Europe, we are not talking here about long-distance travel, is in the judgment of enlightened people one of the most important parts of education in youth and a part of the experience in old age. Traveling expands the mind, elevates it, enriches it with knowledge, and cures it of national prejudices. It is a kind of study that cannot be made up for by books and by the reports of others. One must judge men, places, and objects for oneself. Although the author of the French Encyclopedia insists that traveling educational experience cannot be properly acquired by reading books and reports of others, numerous specialty guidebooks and travel journals were developed during this time to meet the needs of wealthy travelers and their tutors. For example, the term Grand Tour was introduced by Richard Lascelles in his book Voyage to Italy, published in 1670. From the worldly title of the book, we can learn that Mr. Lascelles was a tutor who accompanied his mentees in their traveling across Europe 5 times. In these guidebook and travel journals, we can find notes not only on touristic curiosity, but also mores and habits of people. In other words, the element of both big C and small c culture. For example, Mr. Russell announces that his book contains the characters of the people and the description of the chief towns, churches, monasteries, tombs, libraries, palaces, villas, gardens, pictures, statues, and antiquities, as also of the interest, government, riches, forces of all the princes, with instructions concerning travel. Also, in these guidebook and travel journals, we can find remarks about language, like in the book Observations and Reflections Made in the Course of a Journey Through France, Italy, and Germany, published by Lynch Piozzi in 1789, 100 years later than Lascelles' guidebook. We can help by mentioning the literary masterpiece inspired by the Grand Tour writing, A Sentimental Journey to France and Italy by Mr. Yorick, written by famous English author Laurence Sterne in 1768. Sterne traveled to France and Italy to find relief from persistent tuberculosis and described his experience in his famous book. The traveling narrator shares his personal sentimental observations on mores and languages he observes in the countries visited. For example, in the chapter Montreuil, we can find an ironical observation of the contextual resemblance of two French expressions, tant pis and tant mieux, which are supposed to mean literally the opposite, so much the worse, so much the better. Using contemporary terminology, Sterne addresses a pragmatic aspect of French that is its appropriate use in social cultural context. We can conclude until the mid-19th century, it was rather travel writing which provides information on culture of foreign countries, mainly in the concept of traveling abroad, so-called travel realia, random big C and small c culture-related fact. As we shall see later, second language textbooks on that time did not aim to teach culture. However, second language education was completing the travel writing by taking care of preparing travelers for everyday polite communication with foreigners. Thus, textbooks of that time often included dialogues suggesting to be learned by heart. These dialogues referred to everyday polite conversations, so-called conversational realia. By realia, and Kunde, we understand factual information referring to different aspects of real life in other countries, including the information needed for traveling and politely conversing in foreign languages. Realia reflects an object-oriented representation of culture. The concept realia was introduced at the end of the 19th century by second language educators, and we will have an opportunity to take a closer look of this important concept while speaking about second language teaching methods of that time. As a result of developing a societal understanding of culture in solid connection with traveler's perspective, historicism, and national consciousness, we can observe the establishment of some interdisciplinary clusters. By interdisciplinary clusters, we understand associations between disciplines which remain relevant for teaching culture in second language classroom today. The first interdisciplinary association is that between literature and language. Alongside the broad societal understanding of culture applied to all manifestations of national life, we can observe a narrowing of the concept of culture to its artistic dimensions. This narrow understanding, refers to the achievements of symbolic, aesthetic creativeness of a nation. Above all the arts, literature comes to the front. We can easily understand the logic behind this trend of associating language learning and literature. If language is the most salient manifestation of a national spirit, in this case, it's not surprising that artistic production in this language, literature, become both the way to learn language by reading literary masterpieces and the ultimate goal of learning languages, that is understanding the character, the spirit of a nation as it expressed in literature written in the language the nation speaks. We call literocentrism in second language education the conception of language learning through literature and having literature and the goal of learning languages. This conception is based on the belief that literature provides the quickest access to the spirit of nation. The literocentrism also evolved into establishing a hybrid academic discipline you know very well under the name philology. Earlier, philology, referred to studies of ancient languages such as Latin, Greek, Biblical Hebrew, or historical studies of modern languages such as Middle English through available written sources. In French and English, the term philology and philologie still refer only to these historical studies of languages and written resources. However, in several national academic traditions, such as German, Spanish, and Russian, the notion of philology spread to name the discipline that combines modern languages and contemporary literary studies. We can find this term in the names of university departments and programs. Let's see the contemporary Russian definition of philologia from Wikipedia as ensemble of disciplines that study the culture of a people as expressed in its language and literary works. This definition clearly demonstrates that the association between language and literature is grounded in the idea of culture understood as expression of the spirit of nation, Volksgeist. The à la philologie perspective and literature centrism have remained very influential over the entire history of second language education, and its echoes can still be felt to this day. In 1968, Norton Brooks criticized the humanistic scholars, many of whom feel that language studies should be illuminated by and oriented toward one field only, literature. 30 years later, the situation seems to be the same. In 1993, Janet Fleming notes that traditionally the teaching of culture has been linked with the teaching of language structure and literature. Now I suggest you to take a moment to think back to the typologies of culture in second language education we studied in Unit 1, in which literature centrism is evident. Of course, the Brötchen-Gretchen model as a variation of Big C, Small c culture model is grounded in literature centrism. Literature is quoted in the first place on the list of cultural phenomena belonging to Big C culture, Gretchenkunde. It is viewed as the goal of second language education. Some echoes of the literature centrism can be found in the typologies which try to switch focus from the object toward the subject-oriented dimensions of culture. For example, Hammerly's model distinguishes three aspects of culture: information culture, achievement culture, and behavioral culture. The achievement culture is defined as the artistic and literary accomplishment, the accomplishment in letters, arts, and music. Tomalin and Stemplansky's model comprises three elements: products, behaviors, and ideas. Cultural products refer to artistic achievement: literature, folklore, art, music, and architecture. Another interdisciplinary cluster resulting from the nation-oriented understanding of culture is the triad literature, geography, history. The logic behind this association is also understandable. Each element of this triad refers to a specific aspect of the culture understood as a bounding agent of the concept of nation. Take a moment to think back to the typology of culture in second language education we studied in Unit 1, where we can observe the echoes of the association between literature, history, and geography. Again, we can observe the association between literature, history, and geography in the Brötchenkunde-Gretchenkunde model as a variation of the big C, small c culture model, and in Hammerly's model too. In the Brötchenkunde-Gretchenkunde model, history and geography belong to the aspects of culture suggested to be taught to beginners, Brötchenkunde, while literature is suggested for advanced students, Gretchenkunde. In Hammerly model, which distinguish information, achievement, and behavioral culture, the information culture is defined through references to history and geography, while achievement culture includes literature, along with other artistic phenomena. The contemporary object-oriented understanding of culture, having a societal, national, and aesthetic dimensions, traveler's point of view, and associated to geography and history, emerged in the 18th, 19th centuries under the influence of many factors such as emergence of historical thinking, the development of national consciousness, and massive exploratory and educational traveling abroad. The most important for second language education features of this new understanding of culture are the following. First, the culture, closely related to language, is a manifestation of a national spirit and an important factor of national education. Second, the understanding of culture is often influenced by literature-centrism and a la Philologia perspective, association between language and literary studies, because language and literature are considered as the most salient manifestations of the spirit of nation. Culture was often viewed as an association between literature and other important characteristics of the concept of nation, such as geography and history. Culture of other people were often described from a traveler's point of view, both expressing curiosity and objectivizing cultures by presenting them as alien and exotic. Systematic teaching of culture was not an aim of second language textbooks and classrooms. It was travel writing which provided information on foreign cultures by presenting them from a subjective perspective of a traveler. The interest in other cultures was mainly manifest as the interest in realia, object-oriented information on real-life culture in other countries, including travel realia and conversational realia. In the next part of the lecture, we will see how these features were integrated into second language methodology of that time, specifically in the grammar translation method and the direct or natural method.